where we are right now is that if you have a job that is, remote, doable remotely, which at this point is most laptop jobs, right?
The computers
most white-collar jobs.
Maybe get better at that.
Yeah, it feels really achievable that we're going to be able to get there.
This is very unintuitive because forever technology replaced blue-collar work, but now technology is replacing the bureaucrats, and the blue-collar like plumbers are like, we're fine. But
yeah,
the annoying lawyer people are like, they're in trouble.
I mean, the thing right now is what we're seeing is that technology is basically eliminating the rote parts of the jobs, right? So when I used to program, I remember I would have to write all these like XML configs, and nowadays you just ask GPT-4 and it'll write the XML configs for you. But you want to do something really interesting, then you need to bring your human intelligence to the problem, even if it's just telling the model how to go about it.
So you're closer to this than 99.999% of people in the world. So I want to ask your intuition, because I've talked to Sam, obviously, who's involved in this, and I think you may even be more technical than him and you're really close to the research. So, the next 10, 20 years, like what else are you just going to be able to do everything people can do in 5 or 10 years? Is this like a total change in all of reality by the 2030s? Are there actually a lot more steps potentially still? Like what's going to happen here?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is people call AGI, is that it's very clear to me, and I think it's clear to people who are working in the field, that progress is going to continue to happen. What's hard to predict is when you actually are able to do a particular job. When there's so many different things that are wrapped up in any particular job, that it may turn out that something we didn't even expect was the last thing that needed to be automated. So I think we're going to have a long time.
We may not have like perfectly realistic Westworld robots walking around in like 7 or 8 years.
Robotics, we're probably going to need AI to write that, to figure out how to build robots for us.
But you're going to that's the other question is, I don't know what's public or not, so push back on me. But the thing I've heard from various people is you could probably do GPT 5 and 6 and maybe 7 with people. And then at some point you're going to need to get to 8 or 9 or whatever. You're going to need GPT itself to do that. If I was running a research group, I'd already be trying to probably figure out how to get this thing to teach itself in different ways. That's probably there's lots of concepts there, I'd imagine, that you're trying to figure out. Like how far are we away from it teaching itself? And is that a thing you guys are working on that you could say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I think that's sort of the open problem that everybody sees right now, is that, the current, as you say, the current GPTs are all just mimicking what humans do. So how do you unlock creativity, right? And if you think about it, it's that same problem we had with Dota or with games, where because you have this structured environment of a game,
it was able to be creative within the structured environment by trying
right.
new things. So how do you give it the ability to be creative within the structured environment of reality?
And that we don't know. And I think the interesting thing even now is just how do you build a structure of reality for the agent to play in?
That's interesting. I mean, I imagine you already have lots of versions of 3D structures of reality, obviously, for robotics to play in, but I guess it's more complicated to have a structure of like human reality.
I think the most interesting structure we have now is actually the compiler, the interpreter, and being able to write code, run code, see what happens.
Interesting. So that's actually a more dynamic place for them to live, is like learning how to write code and iterating on what happens with code it writes.
Yeah, I actually spent a lot of time at OpenAI thinking about 3D worlds, and ultimately the problem with the 3D world is it's very limited because you have to create everything interesting that's in there.
That's fair. Right? There's no. I guess you could create a bunch of like human and emotional actors or something like this for it to interact with, but you're going to create some really dorky robots. They're all just going to be really good coders.
But hey, you know what? You can you can be all the non-dorkiness. Humans can bring the non-dorkiness, well, and
I will not be able to bring that, but normal people will be able to bring that for you. It's almost like you kind of need more human data. Like you need more data about how people just do normal human things and how they're feeling and how they're thinking, right? Because that's what we're missing.
Well, it's unclear. The funny thing is, there's actually a ton of if you just think about the internet, it is so huge. There's so much. And so there is a lot of data out there about how, if you think about a math problem, like how to approach the math problem, how to iterate on it, how to work with it. And then the other thing that we've done and that other companies have done in the last couple of years is hire humans to give us data. So, you start by training these models like GPT-4 on the internet. And there's this finishing step that you do, which is called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF. Mm-hmm. Reinforcement learning, it's like Pavlov's dogs. You give it a treat if it does the right thing. And human feedback means that you have humans who are doing it.
Yeah.
And so they'll have it, try to solve a problem. And if it has a good approach to solving a problem, then they'll say, great, you had a great approach. Whether it got the right answer or not, that turns out to be really helpful. And just do this over and over again. And you don't have a ton of data compared to what you pre-trained on.
One thing that's been unintuitive to a lot of us, we haven't caught up on any of this, is just that you think it would get better and better over time, but a lot of people seem to experience it getting worse over time, at least their latest interactions. Are they correct that somehow some parts of it seem to be getting worse over time, or do you have any thoughts on that?
We think it's actually getting better over time. That some of the reports are sort of confounding various different
so
things.
People are just confused about.
I think people are just confused about this.
Because even really smart friends of mine who are close to me feel like it's not answering them as well as it was. But maybe they just got expectations too high or got confused on that somehow. Huh?
Well, I mean, the models are stochastic. So, it's definitely going to be the case that the answer you remember is the one when it got it right. And it doesn't display that flash of brilliance all the time.
And what's your intuition that you could say obviously GPT-3 was just fundamentally different than 2, and 4 is much better than 3. Like, are we getting to an asymptote here with your work? Is 5 just like way better than 4? Like, how are you feeling about this?
The way I think about it is that we are still pretty far away from the level of scale that is the human brain. Mm-hmm. And so there's no reason for there to be an asymptote. I think it just keeps working.
When you say level of scale, what's the intuition for that? Like, what's the scale of 3 or 4 versus 5 or 6?
Yeah, so you can count the number of neurons. And, this, again, like I said, this is very rough because a computer neuron and a brain neuron are not at all the same thing. There's probably an order of, it takes, 10 or 100 neurons to simulate a neuron in the brain. But, if you look at something like GPT-3, you can say, oh, well, that's maybe a lizard number of neurons. And GPT-4 is like maybe a cat. And you still have many orders of magnitude to go before you get to something that is actually the same size as a human.
Is that really relevant, though? Because, you'd say this is human. You say this is a blue whale, and it's like a lot more. And blue whales aren't, I assume, they're not much smarter than us.
Yeah, we don't know, actually.
I guess we don't know. They could be doing really cool philosophy in the ocean that we don't know about.
But, I think the other thing is that if you think about the data a blue whale is trained on, it's trained on, where are the fish, when does it open its mouth, and, when does it swallow? And,
it's not
we're training on the human data. Right.
So you want something the size of the human brain trained on the human data. So you still think it gets a lot better the next 3, 4, 5 years. Like we're on a curve right now. Like the world, it makes sense for forever to work on AI because it's going to be so much more important in 3 years. So that's your
I don't see any reason for it to stop.
So there's no number of years in which it would start to asymptote intuitively to you.
Well, look, I don't think I can put a number of years on it, but I think when you pass human level intelligence, that's where it gets kind of crazy in lots of different ways. Maybe learning by mimicking humans no longer works. Maybe there's an asymptote there. Maybe we have to switch to one of these other techniques.
Maybe you'll finally feel understood by a creature that exists. The way I sleep at night on this is I assume that there must be like multiple different S's. So like everyone always assumes there's like an exponential that just goes to the moon and the world's over, in a singularity. And I always assume there's like this and then another S and then another S. Is it possible there's like different paradigms we have to figure out that could take a while? Or do you think you guys have it all figured out enough to go all the way?
I think there really are. I think these things are fractal, right? And so in some sense, the paradigm is neural networks. But in another sense, you needed to figure out transformers.
Yep.
And so each of these S curves, that this is the thing that genuinely happens. Each one is some new way of making sure that you can fit more compute and more data into a larger network. And every time you sort of see a peaking, you need to have some sort of breakthrough. But it's not as fundamental a breakthrough as it was before. Like the difference between neural networks and linear regression was really big. And the difference between neural networks now and neural networks 2 years ago is just a series of tricks.
AI is, in my opinion, dramatically underhyped right now.
Love it.
And I think part of that is, number one, we're seeing massive actual revenue and impact without that much adoption, right? So Azure's last quarter, they did like $28 billion in the quarter. I think they said 10 to 15% of that lift or growth was from AI products. So that would be what,
Amazing.
$2.5 billion or something.
Amazing.
Quarterly, right? Amazing.
But that's the infrastructure people are building on. So
Sure.
people are paying them. So are they making, are the things on top of it profitable, or are those things just raising money and
Well,
build on
some
it?
things on top of it are doing extremely well, right? Midjourney is rumored to be doing extremely well financially. There's a variety of companies that are scaling very rapidly, but it's very early days, right? ChatGPT came out less than 2 years ago. And that was a starting gun for a lot of people to realize.
GPT-3 was only 2 years, huh? Yeah, it's amazing.
ChatGPT. GPT-4 came out 18 months ago. Okay. GPT-3 came out in, I can't remember, it was 21 or...
Yeah, this feels more like about 3 years, I think.
20 or something, yeah.
Yeah, okay. 2.5 years. That
But
makes more sense.
three, you could kind of see things kind of working, but 3.5, 4 was when you really saw the sea change in terms of capabilities, and then ChatGPT got slapped on top of that as sort of a post-training thing. So on the one hand, I think it's dramatically underhyped because very little adoption is still creating these massive... revenue streams, but also Klarna, the fintech company, mentioned that they reduced their customer success team by 700 people by adopting AI, and they suddenly had 24/7 availability in 30 languages with a higher net promoter score, faster response time, higher customer success.
We've seen already like a lot more money go into this wave than anything else in a very long time. It used to be like
Sure.
how much money is right? Like what would be not underhyped?
Yeah, I think what people are really misunderstanding is what is going to be the end product. And I think the end product is units of cognition, right? You're going to be effectively paying for or renting something that's going to think or do things on your behalf. And that could be legal documents. That could be a customer success team effectively. It could be a software engineering team, which is basically bots writing code for you. And so really this is a revolution in terms of units of cognition, right? And I think that's very underthought about as actually what the product is going to be.
It's interesting because deploying it right now, for example, in the services area, I'm building a bunch of companies in that area, and it's not pure cognition. It's like right now, it's like doing things to save people tons of time and make each person able to do like 3 times or 4 times as much work
huge,
too.
Right?
So it's like for example, like an auditor, like you can bring up right away. There's 10 screens they're most likely to look at all around, and that way right away they see it, and that way they saves them for each like 5 minutes each time, you know. And so saving them like it's making them 3 times as fast. So so it's interesting because right now that's more man-machine symbiosis. Do you see that? That staying as man-machine symbiosis, or do you see the auditor eventually pretty soon getting thrown out?
In the long run, I a couple years ago, I wrote this blog post that I never published. I just never got around to polishing it. I should put it out. I wrote this maybe 5-6 years ago, which is basically positing that there'd be like 3 eras of mankind in terms of, or 3 eras of intelligence, right? And the first era is basically people. And the second era is some hybrid era where it's if you look at the number of intelligence units or whatever you want to call it, the relative brain power, you'd have a mix of humankind and machines, and then eventually it's going to be mainly dominated by machines in terms of just sheer number of brain equivalents that'll exist out there.
Just because it's just easy to build like so many more of these things.
You can scale it fast with a bunch of chips and software. And
but the idea is these are like serving us and they're like work for us, or is the idea that at some point they're not doing that?
I mean, I don't know what the very long run looks like, but in the short run, my team actually looked at this. If you look at, for example, the services world in the U.S., or if you look at SaaS and enterprise software in the U.S. is about $500 billion a year.
Yep.
If you look at the areas of AI or the areas of services that AI can transform, it's probably $5 trillion in headcount, right? Costs. It's just paying employees.
Well, it's $5 trillion in all services in the U.S. Our best estimate's about 40% of that right now could be transformed by AI.
And then you take a cut of that, and you take 10 to 20% of that. But our math was basically, if you say take a 10% cut and transform employee headcount costs into SaaS software, you're back to $500 billion, and you've recreated the entire enterprise software market cap.
No, it's true. I think in the 2.1 trillion that we think could be addressed right now, stuff like healthcare billing, logistics billing, auditing, whatever, some legal stuff, we think already you can at least double the productivity, which would be kind of $1 trillion pull out, right? Which is huge.
Yeah. And then you capture some subset of that, right?
No, so people should definitely give money to all of our funds. That's what we're going to. It's a big thing.
It's just again the unit of work that we're selling is different from we're selling. We'll eventually be selling units of productive intelligence. And that's a new type of SKU that nobody's ever thought about or had before. Because the prior waves of machine learning, I think where people misunderstand AI right now is we've been talking about AI for 20 years. And that's because we had these prior waves of machine learning and convolutional neural networks and RNNs and GANs and all these other types of networks. But they were a very different fundamental, both architecture, but also type of product. Really what those things used to be good at or still are good at is pulling out statistical associations between large data sets.
Yep.
And so they're really good at stats, is basically that prior wave. Yep. The current wave is really powerful in that it's actually understanding and generating language and images and other things associated with that. It's basically, and this is based on this new architecture called the transformer architecture, which was invented at Google in 2017. Yeah. And that's been the big transformation. So it's actually a different technology curve from what we had before, but people call both of them AI. But I think we need almost like a segmentation of these things because we're on a different trajectory right now.
When you say a curve like this, to me, it seems like the curve is more like this, but I could be totally wrong. You think it's going to, I mean, is there going to be a GPT-5 and 6 or whatever from someone else too?
Yeah.
It's going to just be exponentially better than what we have right now.
It's not only exponentially better, it's impacting other fields. So you look at what Waymo is doing for self-driving or Tesla for self-driving. They've moved over to a transformer backbone and suddenly they see dramatic improvements in what
No, I mean, Elon said he got rid of all of the lines of AI just by using AI. He got rid of 300,000 lines of heuristics basically in Tesla's AI for driving, which is insane.
You just go to end-to-end AI instead of having all these little edge cases hard-coded in. And that's happening in every single field.
I want to push back because I agree it's like dramatically affecting all these fields. I agree, like I said, we're using it for services already, tripling the productivity in many cases. But that's stuff you could do with like where LLMs are today.
Sure.
And so the question is, when you go like this, the question is like, are LLMs going to exponentially keep getting better to the point that it like totally changes and improves it? Or are they hitting some kind of
they're
local
not even
maxima?
close to an asymptote as far as I can tell. And I've talked to a lot of the main researchers in the field. The way I think about it is almost like a LLM steps, right? And when you had GPT 3.5 and you went to 4, suddenly legal opened up as a vertical. I backed a company called Harvey, and they showed me side by side 3.5 versus 4. 3.5 doesn't
do
work.
it otherwise, yeah.
Just doesn't work, right? You had a model update, suddenly you could do legal. What's the next step?
Podcast hosts.
Yeah. I think that one you could do with like GPT-1.
Oh.
But you have these steps. And so it's this ladder that you're climbing. And eventually you're going to hit a point where it can do all of human services, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's GPT-7 equivalent or 8 or 6 or 10 or whatever, but we're going to get there.
So you really don't think of it in terms of man-machine symbiosis stuff. Like stuff we're building now to do these services and win. Will those companies still be valuable in 5 years because they can replace it with AI as it goes along? Or is it going to be some new, is it going to be OpenAI itself that just owns all of those things?
It's interesting. When I diligenced Harvey, I called a bunch of big law firms. And I asked them, how do you think about this? And law firms traditionally are some of the worst software buyers in the world, right? They don't really innovate. They're locked down because of security and privacy and other very legitimate reasons. But they tend to be very bad buyers, but they were adopting Harvey really quickly. And so I asked them, like, how do you view the future of AI? Or what do you think is going to happen? And I was surprised by how thoughtful and forward thinking they were on this, where they said, look, we think the nature of a law firm will change. Yeah. Because right now we hire, I'm making it up, 50 associates every year. Yeah. And 5 of them will make it to partner. But we now think that in a couple of years, we can just hire 5 associates to begin with. But then who becomes our partners? What do they learn along the way? How do we teach them? How do we screen them? How do we have a portfolio of people so that some work out and some don't? Yeah. And so they're thinking about the legacy of their law firms. And they're like, we don't know how to think about this future world. But it also means maybe you have 1 senior partner and 2 associates and 30 bots. Yeah. And so the whole thing kind of shifts.
But it's also interesting. So with Harvey, you have the model where you're selling to a law firm. A lot of my companies, when we call them AI services, we're literally replacing like the healthcare billing firm. Like we're competing and we're doing it all ourselves, but we're doing it way better for a fraction of the cost. Like, are you seeing a lot of those companies right now?
Absolutely.
As well?
Yeah, it's both.
And I guess what's your intuition? Let's just say for the sake of argument to scare people that you're right and it's going to get way better with GPT-5, 6, 7 or their equivalents. Yeah. And is it the case that by GPT-7, maybe they just like do it out of their company themselves even better than our services company, and all of a sudden they're competing with us directly, or if they wanted to, or
it's always possible, but I think it comes down to like what is the other tooling that's needed around what you're doing or what you're providing. And so the things that I'm bullish on are where you own a workflow for a vertical. Yep. And so everybody in that vertical is using that workflow.
So you own the workflow directly.
Yeah. And so if you upgrade the model, it just makes that workflow better. Yep. And so it doesn't matter what the model
is. That's how I see it. Maybe challenge this model for me just really briefly. I talk about 5 layers for the AI value stack. So the bottom layer is like NVIDIA and chips and everything. The next one's the data centers that all of our friends' family offices are putting tons of money into. And then it's like the models, whether it's Elon's X or OpenAI or Anthropic. Then it's like level 4 would be the tools for deploying AI, which there's a bunch of interesting ones. It's like data infrastructure, Palantir trying to do things there. A lot of interesting things there. And then level 5 is actually owning the workflow services company. That's where I'm building like probably a dozen things right now. Which I'm sure you're doing a lot too. So which of those 5 are you most bullish on? Which are you spending time on?
Yeah, I'm mainly spending time on the top 3.
And is that the right way to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a slide that literally has that in sort of presentations I give and stuff. Cool. The bottom side of it, the chip side, I actually invested in 2 companies 7-8 years ago, thinking that there would be NVIDIA competitors, and I was totally wrong. Right?
Yeah,
like,
that was really hard. That was really hard.
Yeah. It was just so good. They're just very good. And there's still room for other players. I'm just saying, like they've really executed well. But yeah, I've mainly been focused on the top 3 of those layers. The other thing I've been doing is actually I've now backed 2 AI-driven buyouts, where the idea is you buy the asset itself and you can radically change the cost structure or increase the leverage of our organization by putting in AI in a deep way. And then that entity can go and roll up other companies in its vertical.
AI poses a really interesting challenge for us because it's becoming an operating system for a lot of things. And already there's a lot of industries where like 20% or even 50% of people's time and action is in some ways dictated by the computer. Like the computer by seeing everything, by knowing what's going on, is very powerful, suggesting what to do next. There's some really advanced areas of healthcare where this is probably actually what you want, is for the computer actually to be wiser and show what you can opt out, but you're probably going to go with what it tells you to do in lots of cases. And so in some sense, we are creating this control layer for our civilization that we are going to be following more. And I mean, is that authoritarian by its nature? Is there a way for that not to be authoritarian? How do we think about that?
Yeah. One of the most interesting questions. So there's a mathematician named Alfred North Whitehead who says that the measure of civilizational progress is the extent to which we can perform important operations of thought without thinking about them. So what is he saying there? Well, what he's saying is we should offload. He's saying like offloading is good. Example is I woke up this morning, I jammed a toothbrush in my mouth, and it wasn't because I had reason from first principles on dental health, right?
You want to just do certain things by default.
You do certain things by default. And moreover, that is what enables you to think about other things. Like it builds up this edifice of civilization. So on the one hand, we should automate quite a lot. On the other hand, history gives us cases where we've automated too much. Normal people who don't have great evil, genetically or they weren't engaging in active malice, became concentration camp guards because they outsourced gradually, bit by bit, pieces of their moral deliberation.
Just going along with what people were doing.
Exactly. So letting people think for us can be very bad. So this introduces a very big paradox.
It's like the Stuart Mill quote, stretching and adjusting his opinion by claiming it with others. So like there's certain people who they just did automatically just to think what everyone else thinks, right?
Yeah, and Mill, I think, has a very keen observation that we tend towards passivity. Like human brain works on glucose. There's only so much glucose to go around. We're biologically wired to be passive. So AI presents this very interesting, sinister, it's very good in the sense that it can offload plausibly everything, but it's bad in the sense that it entices us to give up more and more. And so one thing I think about is like, let's make this practical. I think about what are some patterns we want to avoid? And one is like autocomplete for life. Like you're familiar with autocomplete, you write, you get another word. Like I don't want that to show up in all of life.
Which is the scary thing for some of AI. I could just suggest what to do next, right?
Yeah. And you have kids. Like I'm sure that your kids, when they use AI, engage with it actively.
We don't actually use screens very much because I'm a little bit afraid of the interactions with them. And like what, I see a lot of this AI designed as it is right now as like, it's a form of drug in some sense, right? Because basically it's trying to trigger your brain with whatever dopamine to do certain things that are the goal of the platform. And I'm willing to take risk with myself with that form of AI drug. I'm not willing to take risk with that with my kids yet until I know more about it. Maybe that's a little bit too cautious, but that's how I see it.
So I think everyone who has kids like can really understand this. There's another thing that I think sometimes about is like, let's say you go to a new city, okay? Today you can get a recommendation for a restaurant, a neighborhood, a bar that fits your energy. Like, it can do this today or maybe next month, right? But take it up a notch. Let's say that it can recommend the perfect date based on her psychological profile, her family history, all this sort of stuff. And then take it up another notch and say it can sort of script out, when should you tell the childhood story? When should you show vulnerability? When should you lean in for the kiss? And then imagine that's your whole life. And when I say this,
it'd be terrifying.
Well, that's it. Like you get this chill, right? You get this, like, you don't know exactly why you don't like it. But I think if you do, I mean, some people may think that that's optimal. I've met some people that think
they just want to be told exactly what and when.
Exactly.
It's like a very, I guess you define it as, I don't know if beta is the right word, but it's a very cautious way of living your life.
I think it's NPCs or sheep, right? Like non-player characters.
It's the NPC non-player character thing. There's something like that, but that's scary because the average person maybe is that way and they do want to be led.
Well, so I'm hoping that examples like that can kind of shake us out of this and say, look, we need to hold on to this precious idea of autonomy, which is to say, individuals deliberating on and acting upon their own version of the good and not being coerced by others. In other words, not being made the agent of another. AI is very good at controlling a choice architecture.
The simple form right now that we're already dealing with in our world is social media, because a lot of people spend 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day, more even on these things. And, another Stuart Mill quote, sorry, I have him because I was just thinking I was trying to read it at a time for these things. But, he who knows his own side of the case, knows even little of that, basically. If you only know your own side of the case, you actually
comes
know
from
it.
Cicero. He actually channels that from one, which is really cool.
That makes sense. And so, in some ways, if AI is taking you along, it's also keeping you in a bubble, which is happening, I think, to tens of millions of people on both the left and the right now, because basically you're happier in your bubble.
Yeah.
I'm not happy in my bubble, by the way. I really enjoy going and like, I mean, it freaks me out sometimes, but I go onto the far left side of Reddit and I go to these other places and I want to be challenged. I want to see what people are talking about. I want to understand,
Yeah.
the other ideas on Blue Sky, as much as that's kind of a toxic place, but it's interesting to see. Even though I spend more time on Twitter or X, obviously, but isn't the AI naturally going to keep us in our bubbles based on these NPC preferences?
Yeah, I think today that is the way it works. And you get, as you said, you either get kind of an impoverished echo chamber where you don't have access to these wide and diverse views, which means you don't have access. It's not truth seeking. And it actually isn't good for the development of reason. I mean, Mill makes an incredible case, chapter 2 of On Liberty, that even the wrong opinion, even being exposed to like things that are super wrong, that's what's necessary to even have like a lively impression of what's right.
Yeah, because it helps you correct it and helps you understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If I say, hey, Joe, I think all values are relative. I think it's, you would like be hit with this and you'd like have to formulate, and it's good. That's good for you to have.
You don't want to protect people from dumb ideas. You want to engage with them.
You don't. And the other good thing is, or the other thing that I think is concerning is, it could create a hall of mirrors culture where everyone has a kind of a self-curated reality, very convenient, ideal even.
The problem is AI lets you personalize a really complex reality just for yourself that just keeps you feeling safe.
It does. I will say though, there are other ways, right? Like a provocateur AI is a really interesting concept that we're thinking a little bit about now, which is like, how about an AI that challenges you? How about an AI that like puts you out of your comfort zone in ways that you don't understand?
What % of humanity opts into that though, versus opting into this like really soft, like nice world?
Yeah, so it depends, right? Like, so when you use a Bloomberg terminal, you actually want to optimize for decision quality.
Yeah.
When you are scrolling at night, you're kind of in engagement mode, right?
Yeah.
So what does that tell an entrepreneur? Well, it tells maybe like, look at those markets first, where like decision quality actually
Interesting.
matters.
So actually, there's actually a professional needing to make a good decision, needing to understand the world. That's where you're going to get people to engage with like much healthier areas.
I think that's right. And I have this optimistic hope that it can trickle down, that actually like you can show better decision quality and we can work out the engagement. It doesn't have to feel terrible to do that. It doesn't have to feel painful. Like Socratic, dialectic actually feels quite fun. It feels hard, but like if you do it right, it's a blissful experience. So I'm hoping that can kind of trickle down.
I want to jump to just high level for people, the various approaches right now that dominate the AI discourse, right? So I think you define these, there's the doomsayers, there's the accelerationists, I think there's the regulators, and there's techno-authoritarians, and there's a forlist. So what do you think of each? What are the doomsayers, first of all?
Okay, so that's the most, that's the intellectual incumbent, I would say. That's the most dominant philosophy in the practitioner community. And it's 3 philosophies in a trench coat, but they're all very entangled. One is effective altruism, one is rationalism, one is long-termism. Mm-hmm. So 3 things, you might hear these terms, but you can kind of put them together and say those are like the doomsayers. And the gist of it is that AI could pose a risk to humanity and we should pause. It's kind of like Oppenheimer when he had this, hubristic awe of his own creation.
Yeah.
Or you could say like a tragic kind of Prometheanism where like we got fire from the gods and now we regret it or something like this. And so that school tends to then follow, like, one of the main equations, people get mad at me for saying this, but this is actually the way that a lot of folks think about it, is even a tiny probability of doom multiplied by negative infinity utils equals negative infinity.
I feel like this is Elon's comment on it as well.
So Elon, I think, is an interesting person because he's like, kind of started from this position, and then I think he's moved forward to a more positive view on interplanetary life and sort of those.
He's naturally an accelerationist himself in everything he does, but then he also has in the back of his mind this awareness of that utility, which is scary.
And it's a very math ready kind of proposition. It appeals to those who think that reasoning is the same as Bayesian stats, or that morality can be reduced to like a currency that can be optimized.
Tell me more about that. What's immoral about the doomsayers?
Well, so I mean, the key premise is that moral questions can be reduced to a thing that's called a util, or to a common currency. This is something I would reject. In other words, I think that endemic in morality is the idea that you have a bunch of good things that are incommensurable. They can't be calculated, like courage, courage in battle, familial love, religious observance. How the hell do you compute those things? You can't. They're actually sharply heterogeneous goods. And I think because you can't do that, the sidestepping move that a lot of these folks do is they say, well, the thing we really care about is human life. We're just going to focus on human life. It turns out there are a lot of other human goods than mere life that we should be focused on.
Yeah, we don't want to be in the matrix.
Yeah, and so it's that. So I reject those premises. The other thing is that we're very bad at predicting the future. Like the car came around and then it sparked the sexual revolution. Who predicted this? You know, when you have complex socio-technical systems, it's very hard to predict. You can pretty reliably predict like along the lines of scaling laws where like you add some compute, you get some performance. That's a narrow technical prediction. But then predicting within a broader socio-technical system, impossible. So this group has, I think, very low epistemic humility.
And let's go to the accelerationists. So
Yeah.
This is generally seen as a positive thing, but I think I think you say these people are pushing like towards like AI supremacy and innovation without considering some of the nuances of human flourishing. What do you mean by that?
So I think like the role of optimism, the power of markets, like I think I'm totally there with it. I think
a lot of times this is a reaction to the doomsayers where we're just this is broken, so let's just accelerate and let's not let these people hold us back and block us from fixing things. So that's where it comes from. But what are they missing?
Well, so I think they are taking this idea that, and I'm referring now to the more orthodox accelerationists, that, hey, you know, human life began a certain way. It began because we spontaneously evolved some ability to, you know, absorb and harness energy. And I buy that. I think that's a plausible explanation for how human life started. Because it started this way, the logic goes, this is the ultimate measure. Our ability to absorb and dissipate energy.
This is where one talks about Kardashev level civilizations.
Exactly.
It becomes almost it's like a quirky thing to obsess over.
Yeah, and so it becomes like the ultimate goal is almost the ultimate end of human life is a kind of technological progress, or it's a progress in harnessing energy. I think that completely confuses the means with the ends. I think technology is incredible equipment for human flourishing, but
we do want to be a higher level of Kardashev civilization. That's probably very great because it gets greater ends.
And we want better technology and better energy. I agree with all that. But to say that that is the ultimate end of human life, that's what we move towards, gives you these kind of sinister conclusions, which is like we should pass the baton to this higher, better intelligence if we can. You know, in other words, like
that's a pretty scary.
There's not a human good beneath it that we should intrinsically.
You want to be pro-human as part of this. You said recently, Alex, that some tech leaders are calling for an AI pause because they don't have a product ready. How much of AI right now is innovation in theater? What's real and what's hype? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, the big thing that we have to avoid in our country, but is less of a problem for us than in other countries, is there's just an attempt to dampen AI and its utilization by people who don't have a product. And that is like, this is actually a big deal inside and outside of government. Now, luckily for us in this country, it's a much smaller deal than say in Europe, where it's like, you know, there's all these discussions, some of which I very much support and some of which we can power. Where does the data go? How does it used? Where does it flow? What is in the algorithm? Is the algorithm discriminatory? But some of it is, you'd say in German, vorgeschoben, which means kind of just put out there as a theatrical thing, because there aren't really that many. There are some companies providing AI in the form of advanced machine learning or large language models. We have a slight bias here at Palantir. We build a software that will allow you to process large language models, rebuild the output of large language models, turn it into what we call an agent, which is a safe algorithm you can run across your enterprise. And we can interact back and forth with large language models or other forms of AI so that the algorithm of large model understands your enterprise, but you don't outsource the knowledge of your enterprise to the large language model. So I believe that will be the future, and that these things implemented correctly, large language models and AI are a crazy advantage over people who don't. And you could just take very simple examples on margins in business, efficiency and allocation, resource allocation, rebuilding your enterprise so that you get the most efficient parts at the right time, allocation of assets, resources, figuring out, by the way, one of the most important uses of AI for America that we're just beginning to see, which we're seeing at a company I won't mention just because I haven't, but like manufacturing, often manufacturing has a cultural element. So if you want to manufacture something in America like is manufactured in Japan or Taiwan, that's actually a really hard thing to do. But one of the things algorithms and AI will allow you to do is control the instruments, control production, so that you get an American workforce, the advantages of being in the U.S. and production exactly like you would have in Japan or in Taiwan or other places. And so that is not theater. That is, and by the way, the part that's definitely not theater is you're going to watch the GDP of America compared to the world.
This is what I also wanted to ask you about, because it does seem to me like it could affect productivity, right, which is the input to GDP. And in America, productivity in things like healthcare, education, even areas, if we disagree on politics, we can both agree those are very important to work better for our country. Like productivity is stagnated in those areas for decades. Is AI finally going to break in and maybe help productivity there? Are we going to be able to fix some things?
We had no clients in we'll leave education. We're not heavily involved in that. But on healthcare, pharmaceuticals, hospital care, we had basically very few clients last year. And now I think we power allocation at between 13 and 14% of all hospital bed allocation in the country.
Wow.
We have, and it's simply because the people in these industries know that they need instruments to increase efficiency and productivity. Part of the reason why it was hard to do this is the use case they have is very difficult, because you have to increase productivity with low margins under harsh conditions, meaning you can get sued, you do get sued. There are privacy protections that are the most sacrosanct in the world. There are issues around resource allocation that involve class and race, which mean that
I don't want to touch those.
So those are issues. Those are issues that where you need to be able to track what goes into the algorithm, how the algorithm is used, and how that algorithm then leads back to efficiency without getting into hot water, either morally, institutionally, or legally. Palantir is ideal for that.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it's precisely because one of the amazing things in business is no one believes that that Palantir's deep understanding of the technical issues that involve data protection, civil liberties, are things that generated our product. Yes, but if you're dealing with this use case, there's only one engine you can use, because we've spent 20 years thinking and building products for this. And interestingly, it's the kind of things you use to identify adversaries with software also presuppose a data protection, civil liberties bias. It's not just find enemy, it's find enemy, is this the stupid general we want to keep alive?
Tell us a little bit more, what are the most important changes in our life that are not material? What do you, other than mental health, what are the things that actually change here?
Well, yeah. So look, the big one, I'll just start with the really big one. And this is, there's a long running debate around this in the history of technology industrialization. But I think that this the following point applies here, which is what kind of life, should a human being live, right? And to be clear, I'm not a UBI. I'm the opposite of a UBI person. I'm not a UBI person. I'm not a communist. I think it's a bad idea to pay people to not work. I think we're running an experiment in this country right now to pay a lot of people not to work, and it's sort of a big catastrophic mistake. And so, I'm definitely not that. Having said that, there is a fundamental question, which is what should the human experience be? How should people live? And in particular, and again, this is a classic kind of argument for industrialization, which is the baseline there is I don't think people should have to live lives of drudgery, right? I don't believe people should have to, 300 years ago, the conversation would have been agricultural technologies. And I would have said, I don't think people should live lives as subsistence farmers. 100 years ago, we would have said, I don't think people should live life just as factory workers. We should create new kinds of white collar jobs. 50 years, I would have said people shouldn't be just stuck in an office doing paperwork all day long. They should use computers, right, to do the paperwork instead. And then today, what I would say is, look, most of the drudgery of life, most of the things, and everybody knows, you can, it when you see it, right? It's when you show up and it's okay, there's the form, and there's the thing, and there's the, you open up your email, and there's the 200 emails.
Shouldn't some of our associates be building a few of these spreadsheets? Isn't that good for them to get a little should they be using AI for all of it?
Maybe at some point they should learn how to do it by hand. Look, I have an 8-year-old, and he is getting taught how to add numbers by hand. And so he has he's actually learning Mandarin. So his Mandarin teacher also has taught him how to use an abacus. And so
Amazing.
in
Amazing.
the worst case scenario, right, of an EMP, nuking everything, he'll be able to at least add up numbers. Yeah, look, people should get trained. Like, people should have skills, and we could talk about that. But like, should you go through life as a human being doing things that machines can do for you? I think generally speaking, the answer to that is no. You should go through life doing the things that uniquely people can do. And to be clear, I think there are many, many, many things that people can do. I think people explore. I think people create. I think people help other people. And my aspiration would be that increased technology, and in particular AI, should basically actually make it possible to be more human. You should be able to spend more of your life doing things that are human in their nature, and human in the sense of fulfillment, as opposed to doing the things that the machines can do for you. Look, this is one of those things where, like, if this really works, this really holds out that kind of opportunity.
It's a very optimistic take, which I share with you, which is that as technology improves, we get to spend more time being human, doing human things, doing natural things. It's kind of the opposite of this dystopian movies we see, which show us being more in a tech world. We actually should be more in a human world. And so I love that optimism. I'm not used to getting optimism from you like that, Mark, because when we talk about this in the past, we talk about the productivity, for example, in healthcare, the productivity in education, the productivity in all these things that have gone down, in government and bureaucracies in particular. You've not been optimistic that AI will be allowed to solve these areas. Like, has your thinking on that changed at all? Do you think some of this we will be able to change now?
Yeah, that's the problem. And I actually wrote a very specific piece on my Substack, if people want to see it, which very specifically addresses this question of whether technology would sort of AI will eat all the jobs and leave nothing for people to do productively. And the point in that essay is what Joe just said, which is, like, it will be illegal to do that. Like, it's not going to happen because it's going to be illegal. Like, AIs are not going to get certified as doctors and lawyers anytime soon. Like, that I know for sure. There's going to be, like, tremendous institutional, basically, resistance and pushback. And Joe, like, as you alluded to, like, that's not new. Like, we've been in this 50-year period of actually very low productivity growth and very low technological change throughout our society, which is sort of the opposite of what a lot of people think they've experienced. But, like, just practically speaking, most of the big important sectors in our society have either gone stagnant or moved backwards technologically and economically in the last 50 years. And yeah, look, the big industries, like the really big ones, are not like video games and, like, the fun stuff that we like to do as VCs or as consumers. The big industries as a percentage of GDP are healthcare, education, housing, law, government, and military. And those things have stagnated or moved backwards in terms of productivity growth. So look, by default, the system as we are living in it today, it does not want the kind of change that I'm talking about. It does not want rapid productivity improvement. It does not want rapid, adoption of these things. But that's all a choice, right? That's like a collective choice that we've made to order our society that way. It's a collective choice that we've made to elect politicians that impose those policies, and those are all things that we could choose to do differently anytime we want to.
Is that really a collective choice, or is it sometimes special interests that are tricking us and making, because the average person would probably vote for it differently? Like, I mean, isn't it our job? Isn't it your or my job? I mean, Haman's buying a hospital now with billions of dollars, trying to make it more productive to scale. Isn't it our job to kind of get in here and kind of force it in here and show people that our answer is better? Is that you see that, or is that too hard, or how do you approach that?
H.L. Mencken said democracy is the system of government by which the common man knows what he wants and deserves to get it good and hard. And so like, at the core of it is, like, the voter. Like, at the core of it is the citizenry as a whole. And look, it's the great paradox of government, right, that is in front of us today, which is 90% of us like our congressmen and 10% of us like Congress. Right, and it's just like, okay, like, so we're getting the result that we all vote for. The answer though is what you said. Like, the answer is what you said, which is basically brave people just have to step up and basically demonstrate that there's a better way. Like, that's the only way that things can possibly change.
I think that's really important. And I think that's really important. So, for example, I give this example in Texas. There's a lot of things where we've changed incentives. The vocational schools at the high end have twice the salaries coming out because we changed how they're funded. And I don't think people were for the shittier vocational schools. They just didn't really understand. I think that the way they were doing it was leading to students getting worse results. And it seems to me like right now you have very, very powerful healthcare interests in our country. But I think the average person is not for paying more for their hospitals. They're not for having worse results for their kids, kids' health. They're actually for the better answer, but they don't understand how broken things are. You don't think there's some role for, one of my obsessions recently is the idea of the most competent people in our society actually getting more involved in a few of these things that the way our founders thought we were supposed to, and fixing it. Is there some of that could go on with AI it's finally so obvious that it's broken that we get it and we fix some of these things, or you think it's too hard?
Yeah, look, I think that's what we have to do. Like I said, somebody needs to actually demonstrate that these things are possible. They need to be presented to people. They need to be made as much of a fait accompli as possible. So like I'm 100% on board with that. I mean, look, my big observation would just be that you have the technological change and potential running up against societal structures, and the nature of the societal structures that we have. Like, we say things like we live in a capitalist economy and we live in a whatever market-driven system, and like it's only on an exception basis that that's actually true. Like most of the economy is one form of cartel or another. Like as far as I can tell, it's like you've got the education cartel, you've got the healthcare cartel, you've got the banking cartel, and then you've got cartels of workers, you've got unions, that are literally cartels. You've got and then you've got government. Government's always the most amazing thing, because somehow in government you're able to have both civil service protections and public sector unions, right? You've got like a double layer of cartel, in which nothing can change. And so most of our society, and then you've got, you guys I'm sure all know occupational licensing. You need 600 hours of training to become a beautician or some crazy thing in a lot of places. Like our system of society and economics has been geared, primarily to protect the status quo and to protect incumbency. And that's true in most industries. That's true across most of the economy, most economic activity. And I just want to be like, I guess I'm not. I just want to be like, I just want to be kind of objective and blunt about that. Like that stuff is real, and it is a real challenge. And Joe, to your point, like there are two ways to kind of address that. One is to try to go in and fix that directly, right? They're like try to change those laws or change those regulations or change those cartel structures. And I'm totally in favor of that for anybody who can do that. But look, the other way is just simply show up with a better approach, like, and just basically like show up and like, okay, I'm sorry. Like, I know that, the entire medical profession wants to prevent AI doctors from being certified, but like, here's an AI doctor and it works incredibly well. Like there's also just simply a fait accompli component to this. And I let's put it this way. I think that's at the very least also necessary. And I think we could probably debate which one is more important.
Yeah, no, I mean, in my experience, when you have these really broken systems, if you do something like 10 times better, I don't know how to measure 10 times, but something so obviously better that it shames people, and you're persistent, then eventually you kind of break into them as well. So it sounds like you're more in favor of that approach. I mean, because you are investing now in defense, you are investing in these other areas. These are cartels, and yet you are attempting to make money doing it. Is it because you're optimistic that if you're so much better, that sometimes you'll break through? How do you think about that?
Well, the thing that about these monopolies, oligopolies, cartels, the thing about these things, bureaucracies, right? They're just not going to do new things. Like they're just simply not going to do new things. They're not going to invent new things. They're not going to change things. But those systems are wired for status quo, preservation of the status quo. That's the whole point. And so they're just simply not going to do new things. And so the bad news is the system is wired to not do new things. The good news is whoever is going to do a new thing is not going to be one-upped by those organizations. Like the opportunity to do new things is wide open, because it only happens on an exception basis, and it primarily only happens through a very specific set of people doing something in a very specific way to do something new, a startup company or its equivalent in another sector. And then look, to your point, like I would say substance matters, truth matters. If I show up with an AI doctor and it works, it's not like the status quo is showing up with like a different AI doctor and we're going to have a discussion of whose AI doctor is better. The other side is going to show up with the status quo, right? Yeah. And so if the new thing is actually real and has substance, and has the truth behind it and really is better, then people are going to get to vote, and they're going to get to vote with their eyeball, with their attention. They're going to get to vote with their wallets. And look, ultimately, they're going to get to vote at the ballot box. And I very much agree with what you said, notwithstanding my little wisecrack about democracy. But I mean, look, like sort of rank and file ordinary Americans like don't have time to think this. Even if they were capable of like being educated on all these different topics and wrapping their heads around it, whatever, they don't have time. Like they're trying to live their lives. And so fundamentally, a lot of what we're talking about is a war of elites. And look, the elites that are basically driving stagnation and incumbency are not particularly appealing people. You're
going to crush them.
Yes. And so like, in the fullness of time, it should not be that hard to kind of take to ordinary people, kind of a better vision and a better way to do things.